So a debt for nature swap is where a country takes their existing sovereign debt, the debt that the country has borrowed to finance whatever, and refinances that on better terms and uses the savings that they've created from that transaction to finance climate and conservation projects. There's two types of debt for nature swaps, and one is a bilateral swap, which when I hear debt for nature swap, that's what I think is one country lending to another country, where the first country forgives that debt and they no longer have an obligation, and all of the money that they were paying back in interest and principal to the lending country, they use that money to finance their nature. And historically, most of them have been debt for nature swaps, but there's also debt for climate and there's debt for health and other solutions. Currently, what the new form, kind of the second round of these, is a commercial debt for nature swap, where we refinance euro bonds that a country has, or we could also do commercial loans that a country has borrowed from the private sector. Those tend to be the most expensive debt that a country has. Multilateral debt is usually very highly concessional or even zero interest, and bilateral is concessional and low interest, and commercial debt is usually the most expensive. So we allow a country an opportunity to refinance that with a loan that we create that is credit enhanced by another country, so it's at much lower rates. And we can extend to much longer tenors, and there's other benefits. And then the savings that we create in those transactions is used to finance the conservation and climate commitments that come out of a country's NDCs or their NBSAPs, and it allows the country to finance what they were hoping to do, the projects they were hoping to do in the first place. So the landscape of the traditional debt for nature swaps, they've been around since, I think, the 1990s. They were very popular in the late 90s and the 2000s. They're still around. They're not as popular as they used to be, but they were getting a lot of success. And what actually happened in the world was there was a big emerging market debt crisis, and the HIPC initiative, Highly Indebted Poor Country Initiative, removed a lot of the debt from these countries without worrying about conservation or climate or health or anything. And so that took a lot of the debt away, and they solved the problem, rightfully so. Those debt for nature swaps are still around. They tend to be, not as nearly as popular as they used to be, but they're there. The new ones that we're doing have gotten a lot of attention, but we've only done 3 of them, really. There was a step in the middle that I skipped in the evolution, was that we did a debt for nature swap in the Seychelles back in 2016, and that was Paris Club debt. So that was a bunch of bilateral lenders that came through, and that was not in the market with the discount, so that was kind of a halfway step. We haven't done another one of those, but now we've done the Nature Conservancy has done a few of the commercial debt for nature swaps, so the second round of debt for nature swaps. This is become, because of the success of those transactions, there's a lot of interest on all parts. There's certainly a lot of interest from investment banks to finance these things, and the capital markets capital markets investors to finance us with the credit enhancement. There's some interest in the credit enhancement side. A lot of people are trying to figure out how to get this done. But even the IMF and the World Bank and the multilateral development banks are keen to, there's a lot of interest and there's a lot of exploration as to how to do more of it, because there is also an emerging market debt crisis that's been getting larger and larger. And as you, I'm sure well know, the World Bank is saying that 60% of countries, World Bank and IMF are saying 60% of countries are in distressed or stressed credit conditions. So there's high interest on the countryside to explore how to do these. And it makes sense, right? Because what we're doing is we're helping the countries achieve the goals that they want to achieve without increasing their debt. And that's the only structure I can think of, because even if you bring in concessional financing, you're still increasing the debt to GDP ratio. And in our cases, we can either keep that even, or in many cases, reduce the debt to GDP ratio. So the conditions to achieve a debt for climate swap or a debt for nature swap are not that, they're complex, but they're not that onerous. Really, what a country needs, which every country has, is ambitions to combat climate and protect nature. And countries already have NDCs and NBSAPs on the nature side and the biodiversity side. What they need to, the capacity that the country would need is to figure out what is the best way to finance that. They're all short. No country has enough money to cover these costs. Every country would like to have more. And countries need to assess, what is the best source of financing those. Grants would always be the best way to go. Concessional financing is good, but in quite a few situations, the best way would be to do a debt conversion. So that takes some capacity, and we help countries work on that, or countries can rely on their other sovereign financial advisors to work on that. Then the other complexity on the transaction is the financing side, right? So how the financing, how to link the conservation and climate with the financing means you're bringing in two different ministries, at minimum two different ministries. Some cases we've had 4 or 5 ministries involved in that. So you have to make the commitments to combat climate, and they have to be clearly marked out, and they have to be written into the loan agreements and documented as not only to what they are, but how they will be achieved. Meaning, is it gazetting an amendment to the finance law, or the conservation law, or the Climate Act, something along those lines. And then the ministries of finance of the world have to feel comfortable that the line ministries of climate or green or maritime affairs, or whoever is in charge of the commitments, can achieve those commitments. Because if they don't achieve those commitments, there is additional costs that come to the country. In theory, the costs would just be the savings that they created out of that would go back because they haven't achieved it. But it's not always that straightforward. So there is a very complex interministerial working on that, and a lot of it has to do with science. So it's a challenge, but that's what countries do, right? Any World Bank lending would have that same requirement, or most bilateral concessional lending would have that requirement. The lessons learned, there are a lot of lessons learned. We have only done the one Seychelles transaction, which was the Paris Club bilateral. We did one in Belize that was a political risk insurance product wrapped from a bilateral. That was the United States DFC. And then the third one was in Barbados with a guarantee from a multilateral development bank that TNC also provided some of the guarantees. So in most cases, those second two would look very similar, but they're actually quite different. We've learned that it takes a long time to get the process involved, and I think the thing that takes the longest amount of time is getting the climate and nature commitments decided and agreed to, just because it's a lot of moving parts, it's a lot of science. The second part is that, and there needs to be a lot of communication between those ministries, because this is also a new product for the ministries of finance, and it's helpful to get that committee set up as soon as possible. So we can start working on those in the early days, and everybody can be working towards the same goal. We've learned that there is appetite in the market for such products. So what we're actually achieving, one of the key things that we're achieving here is that the emerging market investment world is a smaller world than the investment grade world. Even we're going into what's called the structured products AA2 paper, which is it's a big world, it's a big market. There's lots of players that need that paper, and there's a high demand. And within that market, there's a certain demand for what's called ESG or CGR, climate, environment, some type of additionality that goes with the lending. So that allows us to increase, the investors, which allows us to tighten the spread, meaning lower the cost of borrowing. So the appetite in the market is definitely a key lesson learned. We were not sure about that in the beginning, but I feel very comfortable that is there. And the need for the credit enhancement and the need to make credit enhancement as efficient as possible, because that's coming from multilateral banks or bilaterals, and that's a one-on-one conversation with them. So the need to make that more efficient, and because anything that doesn't work that well or is understood from the market just increased the risk and therefore increased the costs. And our whole goal was to reduce the cost, because the cost of the savings that we create is what finances the projects. So the advice I would give to countries is to, as I said, get the key ministries on the same page. And a lot of times this comes from the presidential level, and that helps. But it should be known at the presidential level, and to get kind of the agreement infrastructure in place. So both sides understand, the ministries of finance understand what the Ministry of Environment is trying to achieve, or the Ministry of Climate, and the Ministry of Climate understands the challenges of the Ministry of Finance, and get that together. I would recommend, because what the ministries of finance have usual, kind of common practices to raise capital, and this is not it. It's a different, new, more complicated structure that has benefits and I wouldn't say costs, but it has things that are less attractive. For instance, a Eurobond is much easier to refinance than a debt for nature swap loan. There are things we can do to figure that out, but building the capacity within the ministries of finance to understand the complexity, and that's what we do. We work a lot with the ministries to understand these complexities and get them through. But countries often have sovereign financial advisors or others that are working with that, and to bring them all in, so everybody's working together on this. And then we haven't really gotten into what we do on the nature side, but that is a whole. When we do marine projects, one of the conditions that the country has to agree to is that they will start a marine spatial plan, right? And that's a whole planning process that is it's not a government thing, it's a countrywide stakeholder program. So you have to bring in the NGOs, the civil society, you have to bring in the private sector. It's a very stakeholder, diverse, intense project. So you need to get everybody on board. And then the structure we use, the savings goes into what we call a conservation trust fund, and that is similar. That is also a stakeholder-wide, so the private sector sits on the board. It's an independent entity from the government. So the private sector sits on the board, the government sits on the board, TNC usually retains a seat on the board. But then there's also others in the economy that need to be involved in that. And then the last thing would be to ensure that this, the reason we do all that planning is to ensure that this fits with the economy. And in the marine programs, it has to fit with the Blue Economy plan. So if there's a Ministry of Blue Economy, they would be sitting on top of that. And that's, it's not a trade-off where you either protect nature or you combat climate change or you grow your economy. You need to find out where the synergies are and where the most efficient structure is. So when a country's in a stressed situation, it's usually bad news for across the board. The one silver lining would be it makes these much more attractive, because countries can get into stress situations for many reasons, but the way the capital markets interpret that stress is risk, right? And the higher the risk, the higher the yield. That's the price of the risk. So if a country issues a debt at, let's say, 5%, but now it's gotten worse, the conditions have gotten worse, and now maybe the market would say it's 7%. So if you wanted to borrow today, it would be 7% as opposed to 5%. But the debt that they've issued before at 5% has to match that 7%. And the only way to do that is for the value of it to go down in the market. So instead of trading at 100 cents on the dollar that they issued at, they could be at 70 cents on the dollar, right? And that's where the big savings comes from. So we can finance a country at a lower rate, so they can go out and pull that debt out of the market because it's now cheaper. So if you were trading at 50 cents on the dollar, you could get rid of half of your debt, if you had financing. The reason countries don't do that without the structures is their cost of borrowing is now higher. So they would have to go and pay that higher rate, and the math would just work out. They would get no gain, and they would just pay transaction costs. So what we allow is we come in with a cheaper financing that they don't have access to take advantage of that, to create the savings. And countries can get into these situations for many reasons. It could be the economy is slow, or it could be what we're seeing now is that all of these bonds trade off of U.S. Treasuries, and U.S. Treasury rates are going high because of inflation. So it has nothing to do with what the countries have the management, but there's an opportunity to take advantage of that. And they wouldn't be able to do it without us because they would be paying the higher cost. So in this one situation, it's actually a positive. It makes it more attractive. Okay, so to bring the ministries together because of the complexities of this, we can either start this process one way or the other. Either we start with the Ministry of Finance and say your debt is trading at a deep discount, and we can look at climate and we can look at nature and figure out what we can do to address your problems. And therefore we go look for the line ministries, or we start with the line ministries, which is where we often start because we're on the ground and we're already working in these countries on conservation and biodiversity protection, and that's always the easiest place for us. But immediately both sides are going to get out of their comfort zone because it's the conservation and climate and the debt restructuring the debt refinancing have to come together. So it does take a lot of hand-holding, as you know. Ministries of finance are used to this with their concessional and multilateral bank lending or borrowing, and they have relationships that go through it, and often there's people that are from the Ministry of Finance that are tagged to climate or tagged to environment or health or water. And we just need to make sure that those relationships are deep in an early stage and everybody understands what they're doing, because it does get complicated. It's very complicated for the environmentalists and the climate people to understand the finance, and very complicated for the finance people to understand the science of the environmental. One solution that we have is that this usually escalates to the presidential level, so we try to do that as early as possible, that the office of the president can have a point person that sits on top of this and can see across. And that position already exists. We just need to make sure that position is involved in the transaction as early as possible.